Okay, so if you will now go ahead and open up to page 456 in your book. Let's look at the key ideals, which are our learning objectives. Under our Constitution, the federal government must share power with the states. The federal government has three major branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. The three branches of the government balance each other's power. Okay, so let's look at the top of page 456 and let's begin. The U.S. government, follow along with me in your textbook please. The U.S. government works in layers with different responsibilities at the national or federal, the federal level, the state level, and the local levels, including cities, villages, and counties. The federal government works across all 50 states, and its decisions and actions affect everyone. So sometimes you're going to hear federal government, the national government, the U.S. government. These all refer to the same thing, okay? States have their own constitution similar to the U.S. Constitution. State governments also are quite powerful in shaping the lives of the people in their states. Okay, so we're going to pull up a slide here. Let's look at the slides. Go ahead and pull it up. Okay, so there's additional information about the levels of government. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move this slide up a little bit. Now, well, before I do that, I want to make a point here. As the first sentence here says that in the U.S. there are three levels of government. Well, let me make a correction, because some people that study government says no, actually there are two levels of government in the U.S. the federal and the state level. Why? Because some people will include the local level as a level of government, or local government or municipality. In fact, the local government is part of the state, and they do not exist without the state. So that's why you'll hear the argument that no, there's only two levels, the federal level and the state level. Okay, so let's go ahead and move the slide up. Okay, the number of governments in the United States. Of course, there's only one federal government that sits in Washington, D.C. It sits in a district. It does not sit in any particular state. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move this slide up. Alright, let's look in your book and we're going to talk a little bit about federalism, okay? So the next paragraph, and follow along please, federalism, which is a basic principle of the U.S. Constitution, means that power is shared between the national and state levels of government. Dividing power between federal and state government protects the rights of individual states, but also allows our national government to enforce certain rights of citizenship. The Constitution gives some powers only to the national government, some only to the state government, and some to both. For example, only the federal government can declare war. States are given the power to establish schools. Both federal and state governments can levy taxes and set up court systems. Okay, so you see the slide we have here of federalism. Go ahead and take notes on that if you so choose. We're going to move this up a little bit. And then what I want to do is I want to give you a concise definition of federalism. Okay, so we're going to move this up a little. Okay, so I know what they said and how they define federalism. You can see it this way as well. You have two levels of government, federal and state, exercising power and authority over the same people, the same territory at the same time. That's federalism. Okay, let's look back in our textbook at the next paragraph. There are 3 branches of government at the federal level, each with different roles to play. The powers of each branch are described in the Constitution. The executive branch consists of the president and various advisors, including the president's cabinet and government departments. The executive branch enforces the nation's laws and provides national leadership, setting goals and policies. The legislative branch consists of 2 houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Congress is responsible for making laws that all citizens, organizations, and businesses must follow. And then you have the judicial branch, made up of the federal court system, including the Supreme Court, which decides disputes related to laws, including the U.S. Constitution. U.S. citizens vote for the president and all members of Congress. As a result, these politicians can have a responsibility to represent and serve their constituencies. So this term, constituencies, it is talking about the people that our representatives represent, the people who elect them. So here's an example of constituencies. If I ask which has a larger constituency base in a state, a senator or a U.S. House of Representatives member, the answer would be a senator, because a House member constituencies are only those people who preside or live in the district in that state. Whereas a senator, there's only 2 senators per state, right? So the senators of the state represents the entire state. So all the people in the state are their constituencies. Okay, let's move on. The president may be elected to only 2 terms of 4 years each. Representatives are elected for 2 years and senators for 6 years. These members of Congress may be re-elected for any number of terms. Okay, so we're going to show you a video here about federalism, and then I want to remind myself to explain something here that we just read from your textbook about the president serving 2 terms. And we know that a term of a U.S. president is 4 years, but the question may arise, how many years may a president serve in total? What's the total number of years can a U.S. president serve? And I can tell you the answer that I always hear, 8. And that is not correct, but we'll explain it shortly. So let's go ahead and play this video on federalism.
In this video, we will discuss federalism. Federalism is about government power. Federalism means that power is divided between a national government and state or provincial governments. In the United States, some powers belong to the national government in Washington, D.C., and other powers belong to the state governments, such as the state government in New York. We call the national government in Washington, D.C. the federal government. In addition to the national government in Washington, D.C., there's a government in each state, so there are 50 state governments. Because of federalism, there are some powers that belong only to the federal government, and some powers that belong to the state governments. One power of the federal government is to regulate trade between the states. Another power of the federal government is to declare war. States have power too. States have their own laws and their own police. States also generally run their own schools. Some powers are shared. For example, both the federal and state governments have the power to tax. So why does the United States have a system of federalism? Remember, Americans fought the Revolutionary War to gain independence from Britain. The 13 former colonies were now 13 independent states. States were concerned about losing power to other states. States were also concerned about losing their power to the national government. However, many Americans realized they needed a central government strong enough to unite the country. So on the one hand, state governments did not want a national government so strong that there would be tyranny, but a central government that was too weak could not unite the country. Federalism was a compromise. Federalism provided some power to the national government in Washington, D.C., and other powers belonged to each of the states. Because of federalism, there are both federal and state legal systems in the United States. That's why in the United States there are both federal courts and state courts. If you'd like to discuss federalism or any...
Okay, so we showed you the video on federalism, and I said that I was going to come back and give you a note where we mentioned in the last paragraph that U.S. citizens vote for the president, right? Well, yes and no. Yes, you do, but indirectly. So you vote for the president indirectly through the system, and I'm not going to discuss the entire system here, but we call it the Electoral College. So you vote actually for electoral members, and then they are supposed to go and cast their vote along with the vote of the people. However the people voted, the Electoral College is supposed to cast their vote that way. But here's the thing. There's no law that holds their feet to the fire. There's no law that says they have to vote the way that the people vote. So you don't vote directly for the president. The Constitution states that the electors are those who will cast the votes, one for the president and one for the vice president. Okay? Now, I also wanted to mention here that the question may arise that you may be asked, how many years may president serve, total years? We know he gets 2 terms. He can be elected only to 2 terms, and each term is 4 years. However, what's the total number of years a U.S. president can serve? The answer is 10, and here's why. Well, I know most people would say 8 years, but here's the key thing. If someone served more than 2 years of someone else's term, they can still run for their 2 terms. So here's an example. Let's say the vice president succeeds because something happens to the president, but the vice president serves more than 2 years of the president's term. If that vice president, that's the key thing, if he serves more than 2 years of his president's term, then he can only run for 1 term. But if he served less than 2 years of someone else's term, then he can still run for his 2 terms, giving him a total of 10 years. That's the key. So if you serve more than 2 years for someone else's term, you can only run for 1 term. But if you serve less than 2 years of someone else's term, you can still run for your 2 terms of office. Okay? So the total number of years that a president, U.S. president, can serve is 10, not 8. Let's look at the next paragraph. Federal judges, in contrast, are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They can serve in these positions for life as citizens. we have a right to expect our federal governments to make impartial decisions based on the Constitution and the laws of the United States. All right, let's look back at the slide. So let's pull up the next slide. So here we give you some additional information about the three branches of government, which we covered in your book. Okay, let's go ahead and move the slide up. Okay, let's move the slide up to the next one, please. And here's a graphic over the three branches of our government and some of their duties. Okay, let's slide this up a little bit. Okay, and I do want to make a note here. We have what we and see. I try to make these notes here, but we do a lot more in class because we have a little bit more time, and I really want to try to keep these things short. However, we have what we call a bicameral U.S. Congress, which means we have, by saying bicameral, we have a two-house legislature, two-house Congress. In contrast, a unicameral would mean a one-house legislature, okay? So when we say legislature and Congress, it means the same thing, but we're talking about the U.S. Congress, okay? And so we have a total of 535 members in our U.S. Congress. 100 in the Senate. How do we know? Because the Constitution states that each state will get 2 senators, and we have 50 states. And I know all the time when I ask my students, they give me all sort of numbers. 51, 48, no, we have 50 states, so 50 times 2 senators each gives us 100 senators. And right now, the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., we have 435 members. Now, the House can change. Congress has the power to do so, and right now they have the House set at 435 because they say as it's getting larger and larger, it's just too difficult to do business. So right now, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. We have a total of 535 members in the U.S. Congress. Now, I make that note to say this. We have an equal number of electoral votes as we have total members in Congress. Okay, let me state it again. You have an equal number of electoral votes as you have total members in Congress. Well, how many electoral votes are there? There are 538 electoral votes. Well, that's different from the 535 members in Congress. And the question is, why? Yeah, I know. I said that you have an equal number of electoral votes as you have total members in Congress. But the number's different by 3, and here's why. Whenever there is an election year for the president, the people living in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, First of all, they do not have any members in Congress because it's not a state, it's a district. However, during a presidential election, they are allowed in the Washington, D.C. area 3 delegates that gets to cast 1 vote each, taking the number of total electoral vote possible from 535 to 538. That's where we're getting the extra 3 because of D.C., okay? It's not a state. They do not have Congress members, but during a presidential election, they get 3 delegates that gets to cast 1 vote each during a presidential election. They get to cast 1 electoral vote. Okay, so also I want to mention something here that's important. You should know that the vice president is given the duty by the Constitution as the president of the Senate. No, he is not a member of the U.S. Senate. However, he holds the title president of the U.S. Senate. So in effect, technically, you have 2 leaders in the Senate. One is a member of Congress and the other is the vice president. But the vice president, he doesn't vote in the Senate except, there's an exception, except when there's a need to break a tie. That's the only time the vice president votes. Okay. The Supreme Court. There are 9 members on our Supreme Court, and one of the members, we call him the Chief Justice. He is head, or she, he is head of the Supreme Court. Okay? Let's move to the next slide. Let's go ahead and pull the next slide up. Okay, so we're going to play this video over the 3 branches of government.
How to understand the 3 branches of government. To make sure that no ruling body has absolute power, the Constitution splits government into 3 branches. Understand both their independent duties as well as their interactions. You will need the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and checks and balances. Step 1. Become familiar with the legislative branch. Congress is split into the Senate and House of Representatives. These 2 bodies are responsible for writing and passing bills. Every state has 2 senators, while the number of members per state in the House of Representatives is based on state population. Step 2. Recognize the powers of the executive branch, which includes the President, Vice President, and Cabinet. In addition to having veto power on laws passed by Congress, the President is head of the military and responsible for making treaties with foreign countries. However, all treaties and declarations of war must be approved by Congress. Step 3. Review the function of the judicial branch, America's federal court system. The Supreme Court is in charge of establishing lower federal courts and settling disputes over the application of federal laws to make sure all laws are constitutional. The 9 justices of the Supreme Court are appointed by the President but must be approved by Congress. All Supreme Court justices serve on the court for life unless they resign, retire, or are removed by Congress. Step 4. Recognize how the branches interact with and depend on each other. Each branch can check the power of the other branches so that power is distributed evenly, a system known as checks and balances. The separation of power as well as the system of checks and balances is what makes our country run smoothly. Did you know? Congress has denied the President's request to declare war only twice, once in 1815 and once in 1999.
Okay, so let's look at the last paragraph on page 456. The people who wrote the U.S. Constitution were afraid to give any government body too much power. Therefore, the Constitution limits the power of each branch of the federal government. Each branch has separate powers. Each branch also has the power to act in ways that affect the other branches in a system called checks and balances. For example, the president can veto laws made by Congress. Congress can override a presidential veto by repassing the law with a 2/3 majority. The Constitution is also now interpreted to mean that judges can review laws and declare them unconstitutional. Because that brings us to the end of our discussion in your textbook on page 456. There's a couple of slides we want to pull up and share with you. Okay, let's look at the slides. Okay, so we're going to pull it up. So here's some information here about our federal court system. Now, we didn't mention it, but it's okay to mention it here. They show the federal court system was created in Article 3 of the Constitution. Well, our branches of government, the 3 branches, were established in this order. Article 1 creates the legislative branch, the U.S. Congress. Article 2 creates the executive branch, the office of the president and the vice president. And Article 3 creates the judicial branch, or the U.S. Congress. So let's slide this up a little. Okay, so before we slide this, I'll just make a note here. Federal judges are appointed for life, and they can only be removed through impeachment. They may resign if they so choose, or some of them may retire or pass away in office. God forbid that, but they are appointed for life. Okay, let's move the slide up. And here's the U.S. federal court system. Okay, let's move the slide up. And the state court system. And we're going to play a video on the court system.
This video will introduce you to federal and state court systems in the United States. We'll discuss federalism, then the federal court system, and state court systems. So what is federalism? Federalism is about government power. Federalism means that power is divided between a national government and state or provincial governments. In the United States, power is divided between the national government in Washington, D.C., and state governments, such as the state government in New York. We call the national government in Washington, D.C. the federal government. In addition to the national government in Washington, D.C., there are governments in each state, so 50 state governments. Because of federalism, there are some powers that belong to the federal government and some powers that belong to the state governments. For example, the federal government can regulate trade between the states. Another power of the federal government is to declare war. States have power too. States have their own laws and their own police. States generally run their own schools. Some powers are shared. Both federal and state governments have the power to tax. And because of federalism, there are both federal and state legal systems in the United States. Let's take a look at the federal court system. Trial-level federal courts are called United States District Courts. Intermediate appellate courts are called Circuit Courts of Appeal. and the highest court is the Supreme Court of the United States. There are United States district courts located in each state. The courts are organized by geography in circuits. For example, the Second Circuit includes district courts located in Connecticut, New York, and Vermont. So an appeal from a United States district court in New York will be directed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. But United States district courts in California are located in the Ninth Circuit. So an appeal from a United States district court in California will be directed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And appeals from all circuit courts are directed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now we'll introduce state court systems. Remember, because of federalism, we have both federal and state courts. Although different states have different names for their courts, every state has a trial-level court. Most states have an intermediate appellate court, and every state has its highest level state court. The highest level state court is usually called the state Supreme Court. The intermediate court is usually called the Court of Appeals or the Appellate Division, and state trial level courts are usually called superior courts. To summarize, federalism divides power between federal and state governments. As a result, there are both federal and state court systems. Federal courts are grouped geographically in circuits. Circuit courts of appeal hear appeals from the trial level district courts. Each state also has a court system with trial and appellate level courts.
Okay, so we've shared this information with you. Let's move up to the next slide. So here's some information about the vote for the president and members of Congress. And let's see if we can make this just a little bit larger. Maybe you can see more of it, and then we'll have to scroll it up so you can. It's difficult to read, so I think we've brought it up as much as we can. And scroll this page up so you can see it. So interesting thing here they show is how to become the president. In other words, what are the qualifications? And they mention here that the U.S. Constitution require you be a natural-born citizen. We'll explain that shortly. Okay, so 3 things to become the president of the United States: natural-born citizen, at least 35 years of age, and you must have been a U.S. resident for at least 14 years. So, natural-born citizen, and some people say, well, you have to be born on U.S. soil. Yes, that is true. Jus sanguinis, okay, the Latin, meaning born of the soil. Okay, so let me correct something. So, born of the soil is jus solis in Latin, and born of the parents, of the blood, jus sanguinis. So, what's an example of that? Well, if you're born in the U.S., even to parents who are not born in the U.S., then that's jus solis, born in this country, born of the soil. That would qualify for natural-born citizen. But John McCain was not born on the soil of the U.S., but he was still able to run for president. What? How? How is that possible? He was born in the Panama Canal, but his parents, who were his father was an admiral, general in the U.S. Navy. His parents were U.S. citizens. So he can run for president because he's Jewish sanguinis, born of the blood. Federal law. So those three qualifications are the only three that exist in the Constitution for becoming the president of the United States. Natural born citizen, at least 35 years of age, and U.S. resident for 14 years. Okay, let's move this slide up and continue. So he's going through the process on how one becomes the president of the United States. And the last step here, step 4, is the Electoral College. I was discussing this earlier. There's 538 votes. You should know where they come from. You get an equal number of votes as there are total members in Congress. There's 535 members in Congress. There's 538 electoral votes. You need a majority of that 538, which is 270, to become the president. If no one gets 270, we don't have a president. It has to go into the House of Representatives to be decided. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And we'll bring this back down. Here it is again. Qualifications and terms for the presidential terms. Which president served more terms than any other? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Until the 22nd Amendment was introduced, limiting the number of terms a president can serve. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And notice before I slide up, can serve no more than 10, as I mentioned earlier. Most people says 8. No, the most a president can serve is 10, and I already explained why. Rewind the video. But on this lesson, I already mentioned it. Qualifications for a House member. Now the House and the Senate is a little different. All 435 House members lose their job or have to be re-elected every 2 years. That's not the case in the Senate. The Senate is a continuous body. It only loses 1/3 of its members at any given time. Whereas the House, all 435 are newly elected or re-elected every 2 years. And you can see the qualifications. Let's move on to the next slide. Here is the Senate. Now, the difference in the term, House members serve 2-year terms. Senators, when they're elected for 6-year terms. How many terms can they serve? There are no limits on members of Congress. There are no term limits. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to play this video, U.S. Congress and presidential elections.
Congress and presidential elections. Voting. The people's chance to decide who they want to run their country and represent their interests. But how does it work in the United States of America? Across the pond, voting is quite different. Like the UK Parliament, the United States Congress has 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Unlike the UK, there are public elections for both houses, and a third separate election is held to choose a president. In the US, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. In the UK, these roles are carried out separately by the monarch and the Prime Minister. The House of Representatives in the US Congress is designed to give a voice to the people of every local voting region of America. Members of the House of Representatives stand for re-election every 2 years. Each state is split into districts, and each district votes for one representative. The number of districts depends on the population of each state. For example, California, the most populous state, is split into 53 districts, so it has 53 representatives. But Alaska, which is huge but has a really small population, only has one district, and therefore only one representative in the House. Like the UK House of Commons, the election system is first past the post, so the candidate with the most votes in each district wins a seat in the House of Representatives. The party that wins a majority of seats in the House takes control. The ideal situation for a president is that the House is controlled by their own party. However, with elections held every 2 years, there's always a midterm election in the middle of the president's time in office. If the public thinks that the president's not doing a great job, they can vote in more members of the opposition party, making it more difficult for the president to pass laws. The Senate in the US Congress, like the House of Lords in the UK Parliament, is sometimes called the upper house. George Washington described the Senate as the saucer that cools the coffee, meaning that it's their job to scrutinize and question all proposals made by both the House of Representatives and the President, before voting to decide whether they should proceed as law. Senators, like members of the House of Representatives, are also elected to their seats by the public. Senators serve 6-year terms, and elections are staggered, so every 2 years, a third of the senators run for re-election. Each state is represented by 2 senators, regardless of its population. And again, the first past the post voting system is used, so the candidate with the most votes wins. So how do Americans choose their leader? Well, presidential elections take place every 4 years. The 2 main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, host big get-togethers where they choose their presidential candidate, the person they think will be the best leader for the nation. The winning candidate then chooses their vice presidential candidate, also known as their running mate, to help support the campaign. Presidential candidates usually choose someone with different areas of skill or knowledge, so they present voters with the best package. Together, they're known as a ticket. Presidential candidates from both parties then start out on massive election campaigns to gain as much voter support as possible. They travel across the country and hold great big campaign rallies where they set out their policies and their ideas for the whole country. These campaigns cost money, lots of it, so both candidates have large campaign teams who help raise the tens of millions of dollars needed to keep them afloat. When it comes to election day, the public go to the polls to vote for one presidential ticket. So far, so easy. However, the public don't vote directly for their choice of president. Instead, a system called the Electoral College is used. Each state is allocated a number of electors that will make the final choice. A state has the same number of electors as it does senators and representatives. In most states, all the electors will vote for the presidential ticket which received the most support in the public vote. Finally, the presidential ticket with the most Electoral College votes becomes President and Vice President of the United States of America. So that's how things work in the US. A democracy like the UK, but on a much larger scale.
Okay, let's move the video up, the slide, move up to the next slide. So here's some additional information about federal judges. Okay, let's move this slide up. And here, this particular slide discusses the term and pay of judges. Okay. Now, you know, since they're talking about judges and if judges can be removed, something came to my mind. I want to mention it here before I forget it. The question that we would always ask and discuss in my classes, and my students weren't so sure about an answer, so let me ask the question here. We know that federal judges are appointed for life and they can resign or be removed through impeachment, right? Or they may die in office. Here's the question about the president and the vice president in reference to being removed. Can the president of the United States fire the vice president? Okay, so the answer is no, and here's why. The president has the authority to remove anyone whom he appoints to office. However, the Vice President of the United States was not appointed. He received this job exactly as the President himself. He was elected. So no, the President cannot fire the Vice President. Let's move the slide up. He can ask him to resign, but he can't fire him because he did not put him in that position. The Vice President was elected by the people. Okay, so let's play this video. How are federal judges appointed? Okay, let's move up to the next slide. Okay, and you can see this slide here reviews the separation of powers. Different powers assigned to the different branches of our government. Okay, we're going to slide this up just a little. Okay, and let's move to the next slide. And we'll play this video on separation of powers.
The separation of powers is the theoretical and institutional footing of the American form of government. It is a safeguard against tyranny through the strict division and distribution of governing responsibilities. The separation of powers is a defense against the natural propensity to abuse power. Dividing power into three separate branches of government allowed the Founding Fathers to protect our individual liberty by creating a limited government. We, the people of these United States, have ratified a system of government which at best is still an experiment. We have amalgamated from the best minds, their best plans, and their best guesses toward that which best safeguards our inalienable rights. Our foremost enemy is an oppressive abuse of power. Its most frequented foe, tyranny. The great thinkers agreed that in order to preserve liberty, the duties of government had to be divided. The power of the purse and the power of the sword could not be in the same hands. In this separation of powers, we find our most cherished principle. Unless we buy in, the architects of our civilization were builders of temporary housing.
Okay, let's move up to the next slide. Checks and balances. Okay, so I'm going to make this graph on checks and balances a little larger, see if we can get it sized up for you here. And then we're going to slide that out. Okay. Let's see, maybe one more. Maybe. Okay, we got it. So that's a little bigger, you can see it better. So they're showing you a graph on the separation of checks and balances. In other words, what checks the executive branch can place on the legislative branch, and what checks the executive branch can place on the judicial branch. And then let's go ahead and slide this up. And then you see well, both of these are vice versa. You see what the president can do. So let's read this so you understand what they're doing here. Checks and balances. So you see the executive branch in the center, and then to the left, the legislative branch. So the arrow pointing at the executive branch saying that Congress approves presidential nominations and controls the budget, etc. So that's a check that the legislative branch can place on the president, the executive branch. Now the arrow that's pointing from the executive branch down to the legislative branch is saying that the president can veto Congress legislation, which is a check on the power of Congress that the president can place on Congress. Now let's look at the executive branch and judicial branch. The Supreme Court can declare presidential acts unconstitutional. You see that arrow pointing at the executive branch coming from the judicial. And look at the arrow coming from the executive to the judicial. The president nominates judges. That's a check on the legislative power, on the judicial branch power, because they determine who goes on the court when he's up to choose somebody to place on the court. Let's go ahead and slide this up. And then you see how the Senate or the legislative branch can place checks on the judicial branch, and the judicial branch can place checks on the legislative branch. Okay, so let me size this down, and then we'll pull up the next slide. We went too far, so 100. Okay, next slide. And we're going to play a video on checks and balances. So, as I mentioned before, what we do is we follow step by step, page by page in the textbook. And then we incorporate these graphics and videos to kind of help you further understand the concepts in the book. I mean, if you can see it visually and hear it, I think it's going to assist you in understanding the concepts that are presented. So that's why we're making these videos and incorporating the graphics.
Next is a system of checks and balances. This means that each branch of the government has some authority over the other branches. It limits the powers of each branch and assures that each one has to work with the other. That way, no one branch can become too powerful. For example, Congress passes the laws, but the President has the power to veto or reject the law. However, if 2/3 of the legislators still want the law, even after it's been vetoed, they can vote to override the President. And the Supreme Court can invalidate or cancel a law if it finds that the law contradicts or violates the principles of the Constitution. That's just one example of checks and balances. Like the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances assures that power within the government is kept in balance.
Okay, let's continue to the next slide. Go ahead and pull it up. Okay, so this slide here presents information about unconstitutional. Okay, let's go ahead and move the slide up. Now, before I move it up, this here, judicial review, this is one of the principles by which the Constitution is built. So this principle kind of shows up throughout the Constitution, the concept. But there's a story behind how the U.S. Supreme Court gained this power of judicial review, declaring laws of Congress unconstitutional. You may want to go and research judicial review. We just don't have time to discuss all these concepts here. So let's slide it up. Okay, that'll bring us to the end. Excellent. Okay, so that'll bring us to the end of page 456, lesson 3, and we'll stop here.